Good evening, everybody, and welcome to webinar number 19. We have Prospera, who is here to talk to us tonight. And while we get everybody in the room, let's just say, where in the world are you from? You can tell us specifically where you're from if you want to give us the town. We don't want your full address, not that specific. Tell us where in the world you're from, and if you want to be more specific, what country, what town, that would be great. If you're a social worker, tell us what kind of social work you do, what's your area of specialism. If you're a university student, tell us maybe what uni you're at, what point you're at, and just generally how you're doing. Let's have a chat. So we've got 204 people in. That was very, very fast. You've obviously been waiting and forming a queue.
Maybe doing a future webinar on international social work, and maybe getting some of the social workers who join us from different countries to tell us what social work is like in your country. And we think that would be a fabulous thing to do, actually, for us all to learn from one another. So if you are, I can see someone else there from Nigeria. Fabulous. So, you know, get in touch with us if you are from somewhere outside of the UK, and it'd be fabulous for us to have a future session on international social work, whether you're a student or social worker. Teresa is coming here as an international social worker from Zimbabwe. Fabulous. I think Saeed from Pakistan is, I think you've been here for every session, Saeed. It's great to see so many people coming from all over the world. But tonight, Prospera is a returning guest. She's the first guest that we've had that is returning, I would say by popular demand, Prospera. But we had a webinar. You'll know, those of you who've been attending every week will remember that we had an anti-racist webinar. Kelly was saying that's now had, did you say nearly 3,000 watchbacks? Was it?
Well, it's had 2.9 thousand. So if you haven't watched the first one, can you watch it, please? And we'll see by the end of the week. Can we get that over 3,000?
Absolutely. It was a fabulous webinar, wasn't it, on anti-racist practice, full of fabulous guests. And it's where we actually first met Diana, who has since joined us as a Connect team member. So, but we had the anti-racist practice webinar, and Prospera was a guest there. Prospera came to that session just to talk for everybody, only had a few minutes really in that session. And Prospera talked about the Mandela model that she developed for use in practice education. But we asked Prospera to come back to talk to us, to continue the conversation about anti-racist social work practice. And we are absolutely delighted that Prospera has joined us today on the day that your book has hit the shelves, Prospera. It's really exciting, isn't it? So
it is.
I know you're going to talk about it later, but we're so pleased that you've come to join us. And I'm just going to hand everything over to you now, and I'm just going to sit and enjoy and learn. So my friend and colleague, Prospera Tedam, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Siobhan. A warm thank you to all the Connect team members for all the work that you've put into getting this running every week. I'm pleased to be here again tonight with you. Thank you to all the participants really from all over the world, and all the ones that have come from my neck of the woods where it's quite late, but you know, it is about anti-racist practice, and there's never a right time to talk about things like this, so we must or we are trying to support that learning around the world. Okay, I'm not going to spend much more time just kind of saying hello and welcoming people. I really want to delve straight into this discussion today. And because it is a continuation, for those who were here for the first one, we did start the conversation, but it is a conversation that needs to carry on. I don't see anti-racist practice as something that needs to stop. I don't see it as something that needs the volume turning down. I actually see it as something where we need to increase the volume and increase the intensity of the discussions around it. So I will be presenting today about continuing the conversation. And within this presentation today, I will talk you through the share model and how we might in our own practice utilize the model to understand racism and to hopefully unpick racist practice, but also as a toolkit for enhancing our anti-racist practice. I'm excited and delighted to also be introducing to you the 4D2P framework, which has come out in the book today. Like Siobhan said, this is a real excitement for me because it's the first sole book. It's the book that I've written on my own. As many of you will know, I have got chapters and co-written with my social work colleagues over the past few years, and this is the very first book, and it was quite difficult to write, and I will tell you about that a little later. Okay, just to get us really into this discussion today, these are not new discussions we're going to be having today about racism. They're not new. I don't see that they're going to end anytime soon. If you've got a difference in opinion, do let me know. But in this webinar, I will be reflecting on where I believe the conversations should be heading in terms of social work education and practice. But I'll also be asking you as participants to reflect on some questions. As I've already said, I will examine the share model and the 4D2P framework and highlight how each of these can be used to guide and sustain anti-oppressive social work practice or education and practice. Okay. I'm just going to ask you to think about these questions. You might want to put something in the chat if you feel that way inclined. You may want to write something on your notepad or just think about these questions. The first one is, when was the most recent conversation you had about racism or anti-racism? So it's a kind of, you know, these questions will guide us throughout the evening. What was the context of that conversation? So how did it start? Was it a private conversation with a member of your family? Was it a discussion with a friend? Was it by phone? Was it online? Was it work related, placement related, study related? What was it around? So a context to that. And importantly, how did you conclude that conversation? I think, I mean, I'm going to give you like a minute really, but I don't know whether anyone in the Connect team want to respond to that, but I am keen to understand as social workers, whether we have breaks in terms of these conversations or whether they're ongoing. Do we wait for something to occur before we kind of, oh yeah, did you hear this happened yesterday? Did you read the news about this? Did you see that on TV? Do we wait for incidents to occur before we start these conversations about racism, about oppression? And as practitioners, you know, given that we're working with service users, shouldn't this be something that we have on an ongoing basis and not waiting for things to happen? So I don't know whether anyone's responding in the chat. I'm going to ask Kelly and team to have a quick look and see if there's anything you want to raise, but I'll ask you to think about these questions throughout the evening, and probably at the end, if we have a minute or so, we can look at it. But one of the key reasons why I'm asking is that I'm hoping that as social workers or people interested in social work, if you're not a social worker already, we need to get to a place where we try not to feel that conversations have been concluded. Yeah. We don't ever, I don't think, ever conclude these discussions and conversations about racism. I think that we can learn from these conversations. We can reflect on the conversations. We can talk to somebody else about it. We can challenge others, and we can challenge ourselves and our own thinking. And we can continue the conversation elsewhere with other people where possible. I say this very much because we need to keep race and racism on the agenda, and not just raise it when there's an incident to be reported or an incident has been reported in the media. And if you're a student and you are faced with case studies on your course that reflect a white majority, obviously depending on where you are, because I recognize that this webinar has people from all around the world, but if I take an England or a UK-based perspective, if you're a student and your course is based on utilizing case studies that reflect a white majority view, you may want to consider the same case study but with different ethnicities, you know, and so, or change the ethnicity. So what I'm saying is we can't ever, and we shouldn't ever get to a point where we think that the conversation is over, we're done, we're dusted, we want to move on. Now, today I'm trying not to, I'm trying to pitch this at the right level. And so I'm not going to go into too many definitions. Obviously, the PowerPoint will be available as previous material from Siobhan, but I will kind of talk to you about this definition, which I particularly like, which is from the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Now, it's an old one, but it actually does kind of say a lot, and you will find so many different definitions for racism, and I will urge you to identify one that relates to you, the one that you can relate to, and utilize that as your kind of working definition. So I like this. It states that racism is any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, and or other fields of public life. Now, I've not yet, every time I've delivered this in training, I've not met anyone who doesn't like this definition. And if you have another one that you use, that's absolutely fine. But I believe that if you're a student and you want to use this definition, you can see that trying to unpick the words, exclusion, restriction, preference based on race, color, as soon as you try to unpick the terminology and the words that are being used, you can see just how far that will take you in terms of an assignment or a project that you might be undertaking. But you can also see that the definition is so broad that you are bound to encounter service users for whom racism is a real part of their lives. Now, Dr. Gurnam Singh at Coventry University says in quite an interesting way that racism is often portrayed as a problem associated with hateful and prejudiced attitudes harbored by poorly educated whites. And he says that within context. I really like that quote because he says it within context. When we have particular people who demonstrate or are racist, sometimes we are quick to judge and make excuses and allowances by saying, oh, you know, they're not very educated. Oh, they were born in 1924 when, you know, this was okay to say. It's a different era now, and so on and so forth. I think what we need to kind of come away with today is that, you know, racism exists today. It's as much live as it is today as it was previously. Going forward, no one's here to predict, but if we carry on in the same way, I think that our grandchildren, certainly my grandchildren, will be speaking exactly the same thing in 20 years to come. So in terms of racism, I mean, you will know, and if you're not familiar with the different types of racism or the forms of racism, it would be useful for you to kind of look them up. Covert, overt, unconscious bias. There's so many linked terminologies, and as they say in show business, they're all in the book, but you know, they are kind of discussed in the book in terms of covert, hidden, subtle racism, overt, in your face, loud, clear, and unconscious bias, the stuff that goes on in our heads that we think doesn't exist, but which every single one of us has. And if we think about unconscious bias in that way, then we know that we all have work to do. So this is not about apportioning blame and saying one group of people need to do a piece of work and the others don't. Given that we all have unconscious bias to some extent, then we all need to work hard in terms of reflecting on it and changing some of our attitudes and behaviors. So now we know what racism is, really what is anti-racism. And it really is the practice of identifying, challenging, and disrupting behaviors, values, and structures that perpetuate racism. And we need to move away from the I've been to anti-racist training, so that's okay, I'm okay now. I don't think that we can become anti-racist by just undertaking additional anti-racist training once a year, twice a year, or even 3 times a year. Anti-racism is active and consistent. So I'm not going to be anti-racist on a Monday and straight up on a Tuesday I'm racist towards the next person. So when we talk about something that's active and consistent, it really does mean the conversation has to keep going. And this is where I'm coming from in terms of that topic about, you know, where is this conversation heading? We need to continue the conversation. Now, in a couple of weeks, my colleagues Siobhan and Joe Finch will be talking about the share model in a kind of a wider, for the whole of one of those seminars or webinars, and they'll be looking at the model in a more holistic way. But today I'm going to share it as one of the models that we can use to understand racism, and how we can use it to, if you like, evaluate our own kind of processes within that. So the share model, just briefly, was developed in 2018. There is a book on that tells you all about the share model, and it's a multi-sensory approach to assessment. It's very flexible. It's a flexible model that can be used for many different things and in many different ways. Now, SHARE, S-H-A-R-E, does stand for seeing, hearing, acting or action, reading, and evaluating. So if you to use it for racism or anti-racism, the S, or the seeing, is about what racism do you actually see, okay? Whether you're a social work practitioner, whether you're a practice educator, whether you're a student, or whether you're an academic, what do you actually see? And what we see in terms of the acts and the omissions, and obviously the impact. What we see is not just what we walk about seeing in terms of, you know, what we see on a daily basis, but it can be things that we see in the media. And I have put there in kind of brackets what we see in the media, and I've put there 8 minutes and 48 seconds. And I don't think I need to mention any more than that. I think that 8 minutes and 48 seconds has become synonymous with one of the most recent murders, most gruesome murders that we have seen in many years, and it's been linked directly to racism and racist acts by particular police in America. So what we see, so the acts that we see, that kind of knee on the neck, and what we don't see, so what people omit. So if you're a social worker and you neglect to see color, for example, I often get told, oh, I don't see color. Okay, oh, I treat everyone the same, I don't see color. Well, if you don't see color, and my family, we're a family of 4, we're all Black, African. If you turn up in our house and you don't see color, you're not going to be able to help me, so you can walk straight out. Okay, you must see color. And beyond that, you must ask me a few more questions linked to my color so that you can appropriately assess me and subsequently offer me the intervention that I require. So in terms of what we see for SHARE, it is what we see as, you know, pushing forward or promoting racism. So it's the TV programs, it's the ones that tell you that, or as the children would say, it's the ones that always have Black people as the baddies. You know, when my kids were younger, it was baddies and goodies. And so if the baddies in the film are always Black, what messages are we sharing to our children and our up and coming young people? The H in SHARE stands for hearing. So what racism do you hear? When I spoke about this a few days ago, it was a really interesting discussion, because where do you hear this stuff? On the street, over dinner with friends and family, at work, at university, on the bus, on the train. We hear racism and racist comments quite a lot within the day. And when I move on to talk about critical race theory, I will come back to some of these ideas. So we hear, what do we hear? But then when we get to A, which is action, what can we do about it? You know, if this has happened before, what have we done in the past? Has it worked? And what can we do differently? So we can't see and hear and then not do anything. So in more ways than one, the action bit is really the bit that says, now you've seen and heard the racism, do something about it. But did we know that doing nothing is actually doing something? So for some people, it's like, nah, I'm just going to walk on by. Didn't see that, didn't hear that. and I'm just going to carry on with my day as though nothing has happened. That is doing something, but it's not doing the right thing. And this is where we need to stop and think about the actions that how we act when we see and hear racism happening. And when I say the actions, you can already think about George Floyd, and you can think about the people around him who did nothing. We're talking about them as much as we're talking about the person who put his knee on his neck because they neglected to act. When you get to that point of thinking about what am I going to do with all this information, I think I know what I want to do about it. Then you've got to get to the reading, the R in share. What are your knowledge sources? Are you reading The Sun all the time? You know, are you getting your knowledge from the Sun newspaper? If that's the case, I hope there's no relative of the Sun editor on here today. If that's the case, then that's not good. That's not good news. Where are we getting our knowledge from about race and racism? Where are we getting our information from? What do we know? What do we still have to find out? And in some ways, it is about what is available for reading. That's probably what's brought me to writing this book, because sometimes you find that there's a lack of literature and you decide that you want to be able to plug that gap. So that's your R for read. And finally, you've got E in the evaluate, which is about the way we appraise the outcome. So in this case, how do we appraise the action? What conclusions can we draw from pulling all of this together, the seeing, the hearing, the acting, the reading? How do we evaluate this? How do we evaluate the outcome? So, okay, you observed a service user being treated in a way that wasn't right. You came and you told your manager. You did some reading, you recognize that the service user's ethnicity put them at risk of something, you put that all in your report, you sent it. So what's your evaluation? Did it work? Did it not work? What conclusions can you draw? So I'm not going to say much more about share model. It is a brilliant model. It's a very flexible model, but I find that it's an easy one that you can work with on a daily basis. And it doesn't have to go in that order. It doesn't have to go SHARE, nor do you have to do all of these. Actually, you can just see the racism. If you've seen it, and you've seen the 8 minutes and 48 seconds, then you can go straight to action. So it is a model that you can move around, but it's something that as 3 social workers, myself, Siobhan and Joe, we recognized that there was something missing in terms of a model that would move us to working with social work or working with service users and students and different service stakeholders in a more informed way. Okay, I'm going to probably upset people because I'm not going to spend too much time talking about critical race theory. I will summarize just a few of these and really encourage you to read up on critical race theory, because in terms of trying to understand racism, critical race theory or CRT that is my view. I used critical race theory for my PhD. But prior to that, I became familiar with CRT following the death of Victoria Climbié. So that was how I got into it, because I was asked to do some work and then I had to do some research linked to that. But I can tell you that as a theoretical perspective, critical race theory emerged from the United States, where they were a bit fed up with the fact that laws and legislation in themselves were not doing very much for race relations. Yeah, so you've got law, yeah, it's a bit of paper, but you know what? It takes forever to process people. Then it's difficult to kind of prove, and it was just going on and on. So civil rights movement, people thought this was not going anywhere. We need scholarship. We needed something else that a group of scholars came together to form, or if you like, to create critical race theory. There's no actual agreement with how many principles critical race theory has. I've written about this in the book as well. But on the whole, there's about between 8 and 10, I guess, and people discuss them in different ways. But I will go through these very quickly and encourage you to do some reading. And the first one, and for me the most important element or principle of critical race theory, is that racism is a daily experience for Black people. And whenever you say this, people say, come on, it can't be daily. You know, you've got 360 whatever days in a year, it can't be daily. Well, it is. And it comes in the form of microaggressions. It comes in the form of micro-invalidations. It comes in the form of, where are you from? I'm from Milton Keynes. No, where are you really from? It comes when people mispronounce your name? Can I shorten your name? Can I change your name? Can I just call you this? Or for me, and I know I have a couple of colleagues on here, it comes when somebody says to you, your name sounds like a piece of machinery. Now that's in the book, and that shouldn't be in the book, but it is, because I wanted to make a point. If my name wasn't Prospera Tedam and it was probably Jane Smith, so apologies to any Jane Smiths on here tonight, I don't think Jane Smith would have got the same comment from a white male that I did about my name. And if I was a young person, perhaps with care experience, what would that have done to my identity in terms of trying to understand my belonging, where I'm from? You know, names are important things, important markers of identity, and somebody walks up to you and says, this sounds like a piece of machinery. I haven't lived this one down, and it really does kind of, I well up when I talk about it, because I don't know what it is. It's because I absolutely love my name, but I could not get past the fact that they were expecting the name to be something that it wasn't. So racism as a daily experience is one of the principles of critical race theory. I'm going to skip interest convergence and go to meritocracy is not always at play. And when we talk about meritocracy, we're simply saying that people get things because they work hard. Okay, so I go to university, I work really hard on my assignment, I get an A. What we're saying with critical race theory is that if you are Black, then actually there's something else that might work against you getting that A. A lot of times Black people think that systems have been rigged just to make them trip and fall, because you kind of do whatever it says that you need to do and you still don't do one. An example of meritocracy is about the difficulties that Black boys, particularly in England, face in education. They start in terms of nursery doing better, if you like, or achieving at par with white and other children, and by the time they leave primary school, they're falling behind, and even further behind in secondary. So there must be something in the education system, and I know that scholars such as David Gilbourne and Nicola Rollock write about this. There must be something in the education system that then is not about merit. It's not about what people deserve. It's really about something else. Intersectionality, we talked about briefly, but intersectionality is something that critical race theory promotes. It's about, let's see everything as, let's not see people through one lens only. I am Black, but I am also female. I'm also heterosexual. I'm of a particular age, and I'm Catholic. Okay, all these different parts of my identity form to give me a unique identity. That's why there can only ever be one Prospera Tedam, machine sounding or not. Yeah, there can only ever be one. Whiteness as privilege is a discussion that I don't ever feel comfortable discussing. I can tell you what the theory says, but I'm not white. I don't get that privilege from my skin color. So it's something that when I'm delivering this, I like to deliver alongside my white colleagues and say, I've told you my experience, now you tell me yours. Can we walk into the same place at the same time and get the same treatment? And if an ex-student of mine were here, male student, he will tell you that we traveled from London Luton, we traveled to Northern Ireland for a conference, and I had warned him. I said, you're going to be delayed hanging out with me, and he goes, no, that's fine. And he was delayed, and he was absolutely gobsmacked at the number of times I was stopped. And I was with him, and he kept saying, she's my lecturer, and they just ignored him, and they checked my bags over and over again. So whiteness as privilege, I don't feel that is an area I can talk about, but I can certainly say that the skin that I'm in does offer me quite a lot of disadvantage, and much later I will tell you a bit more. And then finally, the need for activism is one that critical race theory pushes, and I've already talked about color blindness. Critical race theory challenges colorblind approaches. You must see color, and you're not seeing color from a racist perspective. You're seeing color because it helps inform your intervention and subsequently your assessment and subsequently your intervention. Now get this, I'm really, really proud to be a critical race scholar. I'm absolutely delighted. And then guess who decides to just chuck in my work? Only in September, Donald Trump said about critical race theory, he'd sent a memo around to all the government organizations saying, don't do anti-racist training, don't use our money, our funding to do anti-racist training in any of our public services. And this is what he says. We are paying people thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars to teach very bad ideas and frankly, very sick ideas. And really, they were teaching people to hate our country, and I'm not going to allow that to happen. So Donald Trump is not my favorite person in kind of ordinary days, but in the last couple of weeks, I've been really quite upset because where would my scholarship be without critical race theory? What is he saying about a theoretical perspective that is pushed and developed by people who felt minoritized within racial circles? So that is ongoing. I understand that they've written some letters and they're challenging that, but obviously that might take some time. Okay. I get the view sometimes that we as social workers say, oh my God, not another book, not another model, not another framework. Well, here is it. Here, my view is there can never be too many frameworks or models for anti-racist and anti-oppressive practice. These are flexible things. These are things that move along with the times. They change. They're not fixed. And so every time something new happens and a new process occurs, we need to embed that in our training going forward. So the book, hopefully this is the first time you're seeing the cover, but this is probably what I wanted to talk about today, but I needed to start off with a bit of a background. Why the 4D2P frame? In fact, why the book and why the 4D2P? When I do the actual book launch, I will probably explain that a bit more. But with over 16 years experience at HEIs in the UK, you know, I have been really concerned about how effectively we as academics teach anti-oppressive practice and anti-racist practice. And like many of you will experience, it differs across universities. One thing we're sure about is people are not getting enough of it. Okay, there's not enough or sufficient anti-racist practice going around. So we know that. But I have been concerned about how we then turn that. So if you've not got a really good practice educator who gets that out of you in practice, you know, while you're doing practice learning, then you're probably going to qualify and struggle to actually apply some of this. I've also been concerned, in as much as I've been concerned about the fact that we don't teach it effectively, I worry about that graduates will not feel confident when using it. But also, I am concerned about the other forms of oppression, racism and other forms of oppression, and the impact on students, service users, and social workers. I said earlier that the what I put up there didn't need any explanation, but students will not be surprised to hear this. I had to ask for an extension on that book, okay? And I'm sure extension's not the favorite word for many academics. I had to ask for an extension, and I'm glad I did. It's unfortunate that George Floyd died in the time that he did, because, you know, that was the time I was rounding up the book. I had to look at it again. But also we had COVID, and those two in themselves presented with some unique opportunities for me to rethink some of the things that I was writing. I'd already kind of started the 4D2P and thought there was something missing until this happened. But guess what? We're very good in England to kind of, oh, you know, we're not as bad as, oh God, America's absolutely awful. We're not that bad in England. We're not that bad in Britain. Can I just draw people's attention to the faces on here? If anyone remembers anyone on here, please just type it in the chat. We will look at it later. But we have a young man here, Stephen Lawrence, on the left. On my right, we have Victoria Climbier. And isn't this absolutely sad that in the last few days, she hasn't died, I must quickly hasten to add, but Alexandra Wilson, that people may have read about, is the solicitor who was challenged about what she was doing in the courts just literally last week. And what she says was, I was in black like everyone else. Why was I seen as the criminal, if you like, the perpetrator? Why was I seen as that rather than the barrister for the victim? So, and she'd already written this book. So I found this picture and I thought, this is apt. This is really brilliant. in black and white. She's dual heritage, and she makes the point in, I think, Good Morning Britain, about the fact that this had an impact on her. So when we say we're not as bad as England, as America, because we didn't kneel on somebody's neck for 8 minutes and 48 seconds, we need to remember our own situations and our own circumstances here in the UK. So the 4D2P is this framework that I'm hoping you will relate to. It really is about, the 4Ds really is about discussing, discovering, deciding, and disrupting. And the 2Ps are reflecting on our power and privilege. I'm going to talk you through the actual process, and hopefully you might understand where I'm coming with it. So the first thing you do if you're working with a service user, a colleague, or a friend, is you have a discussion, don't you? And I will do a comparison. I'll make a comparison between this and social work processes in a minute. But you have a discussion with whoever that person is. What are their concerns? What are their issues? What are their experiences? And during the discussion, if we're working in an anti-oppressive way, we need to make sure our communication is non-oppressive. We also have to kind of, within that conversation, we need to acknowledge our own power and privilege, and just be conscious of the fact that we don't want it to undermine how sincere we are in terms of that discussion. We need to listen really to that discussion, because at the point of listening, we may begin to discover. What are we discovering? If you're a supervisor, if you're talking, or you're a social work, you're a practitioner talking to a service user, you might start discovering this discontent, experiences of othering, racism, microaggressions. These might begin to emerge from the discussion, okay, which is the previous one. But using your listening skills, you will discover, you are very likely to discover this additional stress. Where is it coming from? And then you need to focus on that and work in a person-centered way. However, you need to think about this very carefully. What are, and I've put there if any, because there might not be, what are the negative or the oppressive features in the service user's experience? So what they're telling you about their experiences, and I went to the housing office and they told me I'm just here to scrounge off the benefits, and I'm not entitled to housing, and I'm not entitled to this, I'm just here to scrounge. If that is emerging from your discussion with the service user at the point of discovering, you need to move to the next D, the third D, which is deciding. With your service user, and sometimes it's not easy with the service user because they don't really want to do much. They're going, look, Kelly, if you push this, I won't get the housing. I'm all right. Just sort me out. Just come and help me out. I don't want to upset anyone. But at the point at which you're deciding you're trying to be a social worker with all those values you signed up to, you need to decide with your service user or your student or your colleague, what exactly is going on here? Is it microaggression? Is it overt oppression? Is it covert? And if it is oppression, what kind is it? Is it sexism? Is it ableism? Is it homophobia? Is it classism? Is it ageism? Racism? What is it? Name it. And once we get to the point that we're trying to make these decisions, we have to remember that as social workers, we don't make decisions in a vacuum. Siobhan always says, you make defensible decisions. You make decisions that you can later on say, here is the evidence. So what evidence have you gathered from that discussion, from that dialogue about what needs to be done? And the final D is that you disrupt. And just a kind of very simple definition for disrupting is that you're making it difficult for something to continue in the normal way. I think that as social workers, there are a lot of oppressive practices that we have just let slide, we've normalized over the years. But get this, if we do not disrupt, then we reproduce. Now, I'm sure that this was when Siobhan qualified, and still when I qualified, and until probably anyone who qualified recently. Disproportionate. Every time you hear the word disproportionate, it's followed by black. Disproportionate number of black children who are looked after. Disproportionate number of black males diagnosed with severe mental health. Disproportionate numbers of black males who are sectioned. Disproportionate of black males who are given severe treatment rather than talk therapy. Disproportionate numbers of black people experiencing COVID, and the list goes on, and the list goes on, and the list goes on. we don't need to add to this list, and we don't need to rehearse it. We don't need to keep talking about these lists and do nothing. This is why the 4th D for me is about disruption. And I've put here that we reproduce obviously on a daily basis if we do nothing. So doing nothing is not an option. And disrupting is allyship. So if we're looking at ways of becoming allies, then we need to be quite clear in ourselves that when we disrupt, then we are also being allies. And for me and where I am today, I make no apology for disrupting. It does get some people's back up. I do get some change sometimes. I do get people going away and reflecting. They can get quite angry sometimes, but I get people coming back and going, you know, in hindsight, X, Y, and Z. But if you don't disrupt, you will be disrupted. Okay, it's race today. It's me today. If you're a gay a woman, tomorrow it's you, and it's homophobia. Then what? You're going to come to me, or you're going to stay, you know, by yourself? If it's sexism and you think it's okay because, oh, you know, it's racism, I'm not concerned. What happens when the sexism is against you? So I think we sign up to these values of equality. We sign up to these values of social justice. But when we get to the point where we have to do something, like in the share, when we have to act, then we're a bit like, oh, what do we do? And we kind of try to look for the least disruptive, the least offensive, or let's tread on eggshells here. We don't want to rock the boat. How many times haven't we heard that term? Oh, we don't want to rock the boat. Yeah, but somebody else is balling it because you have just said X, Y, and Z. Surely that's not right. You rocked the boat. Why don't you want me to rock the boat? And I think there's a whole discussion here to be had about that. But I offer you some ideas as well about how to disrupt. So obviously, CRT came out, critical race theory came about because they realized the laws weren't working. But given that we are in a democracy, it will be wrong of me, and social work does value its laws and legal framework. It will be absolutely wrong of me not to suggest the use of laws and legislation as the starting point. But if you don't have a local policy anyway, which laws are you going with? When you take that grievance to the manager of the team, what are you going to say they're in breach of? Your blank bit of paper? Or the legislation you thought was there, but subsequently hasn't been found? So we disrupt by using the laws, the policies, the processes. We should know what they are. We should know what the policy says about being racist and how to respond to that. We should know how to respond when our service users feel that they've been racially harassed or oppressed in any way. That is what we need to do. That's the first way to disrupt, in my view. Then we need to think about calling people out. No, probably not in the way I do it. I can be a bit extreme like that. So I'm not obviously suggesting my strategy. It may not work for everyone. But actually, what got to me the more I read about the George Floyd murder, the more I became aware that one of the police officers that was with them on the day was a trainee. And that the guy whose knee was in the neck of George Floyd was the practice educator. I mean, I'm using social work language, but he was training, and this other guy was observing. What kind of practice was he observing? You know, and when we're saying calling people out, I am really being honest here. If you have to call out your manager, call out your manager. If you have to call out your practice educator, call out your practice educator, but make sure you've got your evidence, obviously. But that is because we have seen, particularly in the George Floyd murder, where one of the officers who did nothing was a trainee to the guy who murdered George Floyd. That, in my view, is a practice educator and a student, okay, if you liken it to social work. And that's in the book as well. How else do you disrupt? You've got to state what you want to happen. So it's not enough, in my view, when I bawled out my eyes and I was asked to go home because, you know, this guy had said my name sounded like a piece of machinery on a day that I was just not myself. You need to state what you want to happen. I would hazard a guess, for 90% of people, an apology is all right. For other people, it goes beyond an apology or a verbal apology. So you need to state what will happen. We also need to request regular reviewing and updating of anti-racist policies. If your organization's anti-racist policy has not been reviewed since the death of George Floyd and since Black Lives Matter, I would suggest it's out of date. Okay, let somebody look at it and let somebody rewrite it or just change it round. And if you're a social work student, how about analyzing an analysis of the case or the situation using CRT? Now, from my doctorate, this is a bit old. This is a bit old now, but from my doctorate, what about changing processes? So, for example, an anonymous student placement application form where there's no thinking that, oh, this is meritocracy, this is all going to go well, the student will get the placement. What about we just remove the names and just send student numbers out and get practice educators to go, yep, I'll have 5 students without knowing who's come in. What about practice educators where there's a pattern of persistent failing of Black students? What about some further look into that? What about let's disrupt it by looking at it and saying, oi, Mrs. or Mr., you've had 10 students, 7 have been Black, all 7 have failed in the last 10 years. And finally, how do we encourage yourselves as students to actually name racism? This is the slide that I said kind of goes with the 4D2P. So I've got 4D2P on the left, and on the right, I've got what I feel is the equivalent in social work practice. So you can see on the one hand, the discussion is your rapport building and your assessment. Your discover, your second D, is the result of the assessment. Your third D, decide, is your analysis and decision making. And your disrupt, which is the fourth D, is intervene, make better, or improve. Now, I think that fits pretty well. Feel free to buy the book, read it, and tell me it doesn't. That's fine. I'm really happy to take feedback. And all of this has to be underpinned by an ongoing reflection of our own power and our privilege at different levels. Power, the 2 P's of power and privilege. So very quickly, power is the possession of authority, control, or influence over others. Power is not equally distributed throughout society. And as social workers, we have powers that come from our roles, our education, our knowledge, and we can use this power to either liberate or to oppress. So let's use it for the former. And I've just also said that there's a chapter on power and powerlessness in the book, and you can see French and Raven's basis of power to decide where you feel your power or the power lies within this context. Privilege, the second P, is a system of advantage or benefit possessed by individuals or groups. And as I said before, I avoid the use of white privilege. I reserve it for people appropriately positioned to discuss it. But I recommend Robin DiAngelo's work on white fragility for a deeper understanding. And I use the words earned and unearned privilege. So earned privilege for me is higher education qualifications like your social work degree, some titles, for example, doctor, job titles, and so on. That gives you a level of privilege. Your unearned privilege will be gender, race, and ethnicity, what you're born with. Yeah. And so we need to think about all these kinds of privileges when we're talking to our service users. Your service user who has never, if you're a social worker who owns their own house, doesn't know what it's like to be a council tenant, when you are working with a service user where housing issues are apparent, you don't make those statements as, oh, so you mean the housing department won't just come and fix your windows, you know? Let's really think about the context of these conversations. Oh, you know, can't you just get a bigger house? Those comments that we make, you know, what you're living in is considered overcrowding. Yeah, like you're the one to come and tell them, you know, that they're falling over each other. They know that, but within the context of where they are, that might be difficult. So we need to think about that privilege when we're having these conversations, just so we don't add to the oppression. So where should these conversations be heading in social work? Towards ending disproportionality in relation to Black, Asian, and other racially minoritized people in social work, education, and practice. So all those things I talked about, that's what should happen. The conversation should also be heading towards promoting the idea of allyship as part of an anti-oppressive and anti-discriminatory and anti-racist conversation, and utilize social justice theories and ideal. To be an ally, you need to take the struggle as your own, transfer the benefits of your privilege to those who lack it, amplify the voices of the oppressed before your own, acknowledge that even though you feel the pain, the conversation is not about you. Stand up even when you feel scared, Own your mistakes and decenter yourself, and understand that your education is up to you and no one else. And that's from the Guide to Allyship website. That the bullet points there are not mine. Okay, I reckon that we're nearly done in terms of time, aren't we? Oh gosh, just about there. Okay, so in conclusion then, we need theory and practice as social work students, as ongoing practitioners, as academics. We need that to inform our learning. Only when we have strong roots in theory and practice do we grow our learning. And so we must continue these conversations, because to stop will be us contributing to ongoing racism. Goldstein in 2005 challenges us to identify and name racism. And we need to continue to develop that. And we have to remember, I've nicked this from the football, from the police actually. The actual saying is, bad cops are bad for good cops. And I've just changed it really to bad social workers are bad for good social workers, you know? And so we need to go forth really and continue the conversation. Of course, this would not be a proper chat without telling you where to get the book, even though I know that the majority of people have bought it. And I thank you to Siobhan for allowing me to talk about the book and that particular framework. So there is a discount code there. There's a physical book and there's an ebook. It's out. It came out today, as Siobhan said. It's on the shelves. And so please feel free to order it. Let me know what you think about it. Anything I've missed so I can put it in the next book. Never writing one again, but let me know your views on the book. And I think that is me done. How's that for time?
Thank you, Prospera. Look at the team applauding you. I've never seen that. I've never seen all the panelists applaud at the same time. That was absolutely fabulous, Prospera. Let me tell you, I'm going to tell you a few things I saw in the chat, and I'm just going to ask the team to see if there were things in the chat they would like to share, because I've just posted on Twitter that the chat tonight was just wonderful, Prospera. I mean, I think the chat has demonstrated such a lot of wisdom, such a lot of sharing, such a lot of, you could feel there was honesty in learning tonight in what people were asking and sharing with one another in the chat. Everybody's saying this is the best webinar yet. Thank you so much. It was amazing. But I tell you, this was my favorite bit of the night, Prospera. I've got to tell you this. Conversation going on in the chat about how we need to get Prospera to do a TED talk, and then somebody else said no, we need to rename them Tedam talks. That for me, that was the best bit.
That's clever. Oh my goodness, wow.
People have just loved this so much. It was so I mean, you know, you and I know each other well, Prospera, don't we? WhatsApping nearly every day and all of that. We worked, we've written together. But I was just mesmerised. And I sort of know lots of these ideas and we've talked about them, but I was still mesmerised. I was supposed to be, I told the team tonight they could all listen to you because I do Twitter, and I've just completely ignored it because I was mesmerised by what you were doing. So you were really great tonight. Thank you so much. And I'm going to see if the team, I mean, the chat at the moment is just going so quickly. I know that we have had lots of people say to us, can we send the chat out? And I think we will definitely try and do that, along with, if we can get your slides.
Thank you.
We've got some issues about the slides going out, but we're currently working on trying to have somewhere we can upload all of the slides so that everybody can get them, but hopefully we'll be able to send these out. But we'll definitely send out the chat as well, because there was such a lot of learning in the chat tonight. I know you will enjoy reading the chat as well, Prospera. So I know that it's very late for you over there in the UAE, but we normally don't finish quite at 8 o'clock. We normally have just a little bit of time more. So I don't know if the team, were there any particular points that you want to pick up? Or, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'll just say you could go one at a time with a point that you picked up in the chat, or just a point that you had from listening to Prospera that you would want to share. It looks like Diana wants to say something. So
there was one message in the chat that was talking about, well, it was essentially talking about intersectionality, and it was about the idea of how do white people have white privilege when there are some white people that experience poverty and XYZ, so other types of oppression. So I think it would be nice, like this is like just a question for you from them, even though they haven't asked, but could you kind of explain the way that you view intersectionality and how would you respond to that comment?
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Diana. I think, yeah, first of all, I think everyone has, you know, intersectionality is the way we are. There's nobody who's just one element of their identity. I think when we talk about white privilege, we do talk about the fact that whiteness earns you more than blackness does, and it is a direct comparison. When we start talking about, when we start going to the ends of it about poverty and deprivation in some white areas, then that is, yes, that is intersectionality. It doesn't take away the white privilege. If you put together a white child and a black child and put them both in hoodies and let them loose in a shop, I know the one the shop assistant would go for. Yeah. So when we talk about those privileges, we are really in a sense just saying that people make snap judgments just by looking at you. The other elements will then be, because sometimes, you know, we also have colleagues who are openly gay or lesbian or not openly gay and lesbian. So how do we know those elements of their identity? We're basically judging people from who we see and how we deal with them until people feel able to tell us the other elements. So you're absolutely right. I know that there's a lot of debate about some white people saying, no, when you say white privilege, you're really not, we don't all have privilege. But I can guarantee in comparison to your black colleague, you do. And one of the privileges that you may have as a white person that you don't know, regardless of poverty, is if it comes in the way in the form of a name. So if you're called Jane Smith and you're broke, and I'm Prospera Tedam and I've got a bit of money, doesn't matter to people. The fact that my name is machine sounding and foreign sounding, you have that privilege over me until we get to the point where we start talking and I whip out that doctor title very quickly, which sometimes, bear in mind, sometimes it does nothing for me, you know, but sometimes it does. So intersectionality does kind of push us to say, and intersectionality has come from black women, and we're saying that not all women's issues are the same either. My issue as a black woman is different from a white woman's issue. Why is that? My hair I get told off for my hair. You don't. Actually, people are selling me stuff for my hair to look like yours. So, you know, this is where the whole discussion comes up. And when we're working with service users directly, this is why we do the assessments. This is why we end up with some social workers that are very good at assessing and getting the right outcomes. And we have the ones that really don't do a good job because they don't dig deep enough. But you and I know that in terms of how blackness carries people, that you are more likely to be disadvantaged when you're black. Now, I think today there was something that came up around white children. I don't remember the exact news item, but there was something around that where we need to look at education systems, you know, because there are still black children who are underperforming, not because they're underperforming, but because they're more likely to be excluded. They're more likely to not finish school. And when they do finish school, they're more likely to get 2.2s and below. So all of that's there. And we do know that for a good number of black people go into higher education, but we're looking at the outcomes of that. They do go, but what happens to them when they come out of higher education? So you're absolutely right. When we look at intersectionality, we have to look at all the elements that make us who we are, and not one, there's no hierarchy of oppressions. So I'm not worse because it's racist and, oh, it's better if it's sexist. No, all oppressions are the same. What we argue as black people is that ours is so visible, as is gender sometimes, but ours is so visible that actually people make up their minds right from the get-go before they give you a chance.
Yeah. There's some really helpful comments that people are also putting again into the chat about the way that they understand it and their experience. And I think that's really helpful. And there's also some people in the chat, Prospera, who I think are being very honest. And sometimes it can be quite scary to say this as a white person, but who are being quite honest to say, I don't really know about white privilege and I want to learn more. And people are saying they've really valued the learning about that tonight. And I think, you know, I think that is really important. And I think all of us as white people need to be thinking about how we develop allyship and how we think about disrupting racism. You know, that I think Kelly put earlier that the quote of the night for her was, if we don't disrupt, we reproduce. And I think that's really important for us to be thinking about and considering. So I think there's such a lot of rich learning tonight for people, and thinking about white privilege has been one of those. So thanks for that, sharing that with us, Prospera. Are there anything else? Is there anything else that anybody in the team wants to say? I mean, you can wave your hand up in the air if anybody else wanted to say anything, or we do have.
How much time have you got?
We've got a couple more minutes, but I think we've got a really interesting question here. I'm going to go to Kelly. I've lost it now. What was that question that was a bit, the chat, it went a little bit up. It was about, I'd like to know Prospera's views on cultural appropriation, as this is a fairly popular term. I think that's actually a really helpful question. I mean, I think we've got a whole other webinar on thinking about culture and cultural sensitivity and so on. And we've got so many people asking you to come back, Prospera. I think I'll probably be begging you soon. But
oh, wow.
There's a, what's your thoughts about cultural appropriation? Do you have any particular thoughts, or have I put you a bit...
No, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because I think sometimes people are trying to relate to the other. They're trying, and by overly trying them, it becomes culturally, they then become, they appropriate this culture. So of recent memories, the one of was it the white senator in America who'd lived all her life saying she was black? Did anyone read that? Yeah. I think it's about what goes underneath it. I don't mind where there's solidarity. I don't mind where you turn up at my house and you wear whatever we wear in Ghana, you know, and that's for a nice evening. We're family, we're friends. You eat some jollof rice. You ask me how to teach you how to cook it. You go cook it. I don't think that's an issue for me. I think what is an issue is where there's a thin line between that and being really patronizing to the other. I think for me, that's, if I've got your cultural appropriation right, that's where I'm going with it. I think that there's a real thin line between doing it in solidarity with and trying to support, and doing it as a way to kind of undermine. That's where I would have a problem with it.
Yeah, I think even sometimes people might do it as, you know, to almost trying to say, look, I'm not racist because, and then it becomes you know, it'd be very dangerous. And I think there are lots of issues around it. So, but I think that's, there's another webinar for us there, isn't there?
Siobhan, just quickly, I would just like to say to Prospera about a lot of people in the chat have been resonating with you talking about how somebody mentioned your name sounded like machinery, but a lot of people have said that people get their names wrong, they spell them wrong. People have actually changed the spelling of their name. They've been asked to shorten it down to an initial because people can't say it. So a lot of people have kind of resonated with that.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks for that, Kat. I mean, you do in bigger settings, you know, sometimes in a team meeting, or not even a team meeting because they will know you. In a wider meeting, some people can actually point at you. You know, they'll point.
Yeah, somebody in the chat also said that there's a lot of assumptions around their name, and they are used to for people to think that they're black when actually they're white because of their name. So they were in a doctor's surgery, I think, and he looked at the doctor looked at the black man in the room.
Wow. Yeah. And so yeah, this is around assumptions and unconscious bias, isn't it? Or even conscious bias, where we expect particular people to look a certain way based on their names. But you know, I know I make a point of this, and you will read it in the book if you've bought it, but I think what upset me about my statement was I was in my own room. I was in my office with my name on the door. This was my space. I know I've not paid for the office space. Come on, I know that. But, you know, I was doing some serious work, and out comes this white man to point to the name, ha, ha, ha. And he tried to draw my colleague into the laughter. And she was having none of it. He was like, oh, doesn't that sound like a piece of machinery? I was like, what? And initially it was anger, and then I just welled up. As soon as she said, are you all right, Prospera? Of course, when somebody says, are you all right? That's when I don't know about everyone else, but that's when the water works. And I was like, what is this? you know. There's that, and there's the whole, there's a colleague on here who knows this. I've been accused of nicking a staff car parking barrier card, you know. I'm thinking, okay, so I'm a thief as well. No, you need to park at the student. No, I'm not a student. Where did you get the card from? Like, I'm a member of staff, you know. And so it feels like when we say that racism is a daily experience, a lot of people are like, oh, surely it can't be. But as I start telling you this stuff, you can see it's daily. If every day somebody has to ask you to repeat your name, that is a daily experience every day. Not to mention all the other things that come with what do you eat, and, you know, do you want a sandwich and all of that kind of thing. Do you know how to eat a sandwich? You know, before we get to those conversations, we want to kind of be absolutely clear. And the microaggressions are those, the way they respond to you, that they wouldn't respond to anyone else in that way. You know, and while we're having this conversation as students, I will say that a lot of times I think that students are very honest with, they want to learn. I think that's what a student does. They want to learn. So they're very kind of keen on hearing. But when you try to explain some of the stuff to them that they're hearing for the first time, you can really see the shock. So I always say to students, don't respond quickly, go and think about it. And we know people who've changed their names by deed poll, because there's comments like this, you know, and she went and changed it by deed poll. And you think, well, you know, if that's your identity. So you then have to think, how would you work as a social worker with a black child or a child with a different type of name who says, I'm not happy with my name, I want to change it by deed poll. You go, yeah, I know where to go. I can take you down to have your name changed. Okay, that might be some real issue for the child, but what if the whole idea of identity, where do you get off not thinking about that for the child or the young person?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Prospera. I think there was maybe one more thing I think was Kelly was going to share, and then we'll probably conclude the session. But we'll probably go over to you for the final words, though, obviously, Prospera. But Kelly, did you want to share something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Prospera, when you were talking about intersectionality and different forms of oppression, I was going to say obviously then, but it's not obvious. So as a gay woman, I was going to say obviously, but it's probably not obvious, and that's kind of my point. That kind of sometimes I think I'm quite lucky that people say, "Oh, you don't look gay," and sometimes I take that as a compliment because do you know what I mean? And so sometimes like I feel quite fortunate that I can kind of pass, that people assume I'm straight and I don't always correct them. And sometimes that's about me not wanting to kind of rock the boat and not wanting to kind of have those awkward questions and things. But then, you know, as a white person, I've got that privilege of being able to do that. Like, as, you know, a person of colour, I you know, can't even imagine how it would be to be a person of colour and be part of the LGBT community, because you know, if I feel fortunate that I can pass as a straight person, I would never be able to pass as a white person. But then, you know, I've got that experience of working in a school and not telling particular parents that I'm gay because I know it would just cause issues, and you just wouldn't have that, would you, as a person of colour?
Yeah. Which, yeah, I think you've nailed the point, actually, Kelly. That's exactly what it is. You know, you can share as and when you feel able and willing and safe, but there's kind of no safety in our one, and that's the difficult bit. That's usually the difficult bit. But in terms of us getting to a point where we're working with people who are disproportionately affected by everything, you know, nearly all the things that are happening, then we know that this is the case. Let's not keep repeating it. Let's really do something about it. So in 10 years' time, your disproportionality statements are down from 20 to 5. Then that's a real kind of progress. And you can say in 2020, there was 15 areas where Black people were overrepresented in. And in 2025, we're down to 5. That is progress. We don't want to knock it. So yeah, absolutely.
So thanks for sharing that, Kelly, and thanks to all the team as ever, doing a brilliant job with the webinars every week. And thank you so much, Prospera, for giving up your time so late in the evening as well. I know, I don't know how you've kept going as passionately and powerfully as you have, but I and all of the team want to congratulate you on your book, your first sole authored book, and we know that it is going to be fabulous. We know that it is going to disrupt the curriculum, which is we are all about as a team in terms of what we want to do in adding to the social work learning curriculum, if you like. And so thank you so much for joining us tonight. It has been brilliant, and you know, people are saying how good the session has been in the chat. So I know, Prospera, you're just taking us to that final slide, aren't you, so that I can tell people what we've got coming next. So next week, it sounds a bit strange and it's not as clear cut in terms of what's on offer for you next week. The team are putting into the chat now, along with here's how to order the book. They're also talking about they're also putting into the chat how to register for next week's session. Now, next week's session is our 20th webinar. We would never have thought we were going to do 20 webinars when we started 20 weeks ago, and we're going to be celebrating that with a whole host of guests. There's basically almost 20 guests coming to our 20th session, and it's going to be all about social work and the number 20, and it's one not to be missed. It's going to be an eclectic night, but for me, I think it is going to be absolutely a webinar you want to attend live rather than simply watching back. I think it's going to be a great session. The week after that, I'm going to be joined by Joe Finch, who also, it was Prospera and I and Joe that wrote Share, and Joe is going to be coming along, and we're going to be talking about practice placements in social work training. So that'll be particularly useful for students and for practice educators. And then on the following week, the 4th of November, we're going to be looking at making the most of supervision in social work. We're going to be looking at what supervision is, why we have it in social work, and how to make the most of the supervision that you have. So we've got 3 really exciting webinars coming up. We're not going to tell you too much about next week's, other than there will be a bit of an international flavour. So we are really excited about it. It's going to be technically challenging for the team, and I can see Omar looking terrified already about how difficult it's all going to be next week. And as a team, we've got a huge amount to do this week. You won't believe the amount of work we're going to put into next week. But anyway, if you want to get registered, there is the registration link, and we look forward to seeing all of you. I can see Christian's just saying there, I love being present to the webinars, and we love having you, and we really enjoy the sessions and seeing everybody and seeing the interactive nature. And I think the chat's getting better and better every week, as well, as people get more confident about talking in these environments. And I think, Prospera, you've provided tonight a session that's really made people feel safe about having the conversation, and actually that's a real skill, a huge talent, because this is an area that I know a lot of people sometimes don't feel safe to talk about. So thank you very much for a passionate presentation and really providing that safe environment for learning tonight. It was a brilliant webinar tonight. Thank you, Prospera.
Yeah, welcome. Okay, thank you all very much for coming. I think Siobhan said it all, but yes, please go forth and continue the conversation. I think that we all have enough in ourselves, especially that we are social workers, we have enough in ourselves to want to do something about it. So let's go forth and continue until we meet again the next time to carry it forward. Thank you all for your time this evening, and have a lovely evening or morning or afternoon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.